My name's Guy, and I'm just here to have a chat with you today about how predictive algorithms have been missold as artificial intelligence. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm an illustrator and graphic designer. I work a lot with digital vectors and sort of different file formats, so that's kind of the background that I'm coming from. I'm not in any way, I don't really have a particularly sort of techie background. I'm not kind of grounded in hard mathematics at all, so, bear with my inaccuracies here. I'm kind of just, trying to visualize. I've noticed a lot of kind of confusion, and it's a huge topic at the moment, and there's a lot of confusion around sort of what these kind of processes are. And I thought I'd kind of share a cute little analogy with you that would kind of help people visualize. I tend to find part of my background is sort of like I tend to find that people, if they can visualize an idea, they can kind of it helps them grasp it a little bit more easily. So just to use a cute little example. So I don't know if, I'm kind of showing my age a bit here. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the old forum game of just uploading and downloading a JPEG until it gets more and more visually corrupted over time. So the process behind that, so a JPEG, what a JPEG does is it visually compresses an image. So it's not used so much these days as internet speeds have gotten a lot better. It used to be, kind of sort of like a bit of a sort of like you didn't want to spend your entire evening, uploading a picture of a cat, for example. So you would be more concerned about sort of like file sizes. It's not so much of a problem these days. Like I said, as technology has improved, as internet speeds have improved. But yeah, it would be kind of sort of like, if you just wanted to share some cat memes, you would be, as long as you could sort of, as long as it was like visually legible, you wouldn't be too worried about sort of like, whether it was sort of like crystal clear. So what a JPEG does is it deliberately, in order to compress that file, it deliberately sacrifices some of that information. So it deliberately sacrifices some of that visual information, and the way that it can do that, and still when you open it, you still have a visually legible image, is that it uses a predictive algorithm to kind of fill in some of that detail. So what it will do, so for example, when you look at my lovely face here, you can see that there's sort of like some highlights and some sort of darker areas and some sort of midtones, and yeah, what it will do is with the JPEG, when you open that back up, it will guesstimate some of the detail in between. It will take the information that it has to hand about sort of, it will take the information that it has to hand, and it will fill in some of that detail that it has deliberately sacrificed in order to compress that file. So it's not very noticeable. So, it uses the fact that sort of the eye will fill in a lot of detail. So the human brain tends to kind of guesstimate a lot of information anyway. I don't know if you've ever had like, texture pop at like 3. It's like, it's good. It's sort of like, yeah, I don't know if you've ever been on the toilet. Excuse me, it's a little bit late. I've had a beer. I don't know if you've ever kind of woken up at 3 a.m. and you've kind of sort of like you sat there on the loo, and you're kind of sort of looking at your lino, and it, I don't know if you've got that kind of lino that has quite a lot of sort of like texture to it. It's got lots of dots and dashes, and you get this thing like you get this thing called like texture pop, where suddenly sort of a pattern of dots and dashes will just like pop out at you, and you're like, oh goodness. And it's because your brain is it can't possibly take in all of the information. It can't possibly, process all of the information that's coming in at it. So it summarizes for you, and it will, what it's doing when you're kind of sort of like, you're half awake and you're kind of sort of like still sort of like thinking about that dream you were having about toast or something, and you're staring at that texture on the floor and you get that texture pop. It's because your brain has suddenly, it's been summarizing the pattern on the floor for you. It's been giving you sort of it's been giving you sort of like an estimation of that texture on the floor, and suddenly you become consciously aware of a particular pattern of dots and dashes. And yeah, it kind of sort of like, the effect is that it kind of pops out at you and you're like, oh, I didn't notice that. But yeah, so kind of JPEGs work on a similar sort of level. They kind of work with sort of like similar principles, where they kind of sort of like, they estimate that information, and that's fine for a couple of times if you've sort of like shared it around a couple of times. But what you start to notice with a particularly sort of well used JPEG is they start to get that kind of visually crunchy effect. You start to get sort of like this kind of really sort of blocky texture, that really kind of sort of like blown out blocky texture, and it gets to sort of like, it starts to become sort of particularly jagged around sort of like boundaries, sort of like, yeah, sort of my head against the wall there, it would get sort of like pretty jagged, and you get these odd sort of glitchy colours. It's because once you've shared it around a few times, it's starting to estimate based off of already estimated data. And that's kind of what I want to highlight behind these. I mean, obviously, sort of as kind of, technology's advanced, these algorithms have become more advanced, and I want to kind of state again that I don't have a particularly sort of techie background, so yeah, feel free, I'll leave the comments open, feel free to, correct me and correct my inaccuracies here. It's just kind of a cute example just to underline kind of what's going on here, and kind of why it is particularly dangerous and irresponsible to mismarket these kind of predictive algorithms as artificial intelligence. So what it's doing is it's estimating information based off of the existing data that it has. So that's fine for, you can share it around a couple of times and that's fine, but with a particularly well used JPEG, you get that crunchy texture where it's estimating based off of estimated data. So the way that these algorithms work, it's by design, and it's part of their strength when you're using them appropriately. It's part of their strength. So what they're really, really good at, so like I said, I use digital vectors a lot. So it's really, really good, for example, if you've got sort of like, 2 data points, and so, I draw a line and there's a little bit of natural jitter in that line. So I draw a smiley face and that's, a little bit wiggly. The predictive algorithm will correct for that jitter. So it's really, really good at, correcting, say, like I said, a vector line. It's really, really good as autopilot. It's been around for years and years as sort of autopilot technology. It's kind of sort of what allows, because I mean, our human reaction times, as incredible as we are as creatures, we were never ever meant to, fly a plane at hundreds of miles an hour across, vast stretches of sky. We have been using these kinds of predictive algorithms to help, correct sort of like our flight paths, and autopilot technology has been around for a long, long time. It's really good at correcting for, if you're using it in sort of a self-driving car. It's really, really dangerous to market it as self-driving because, what it does is it estimates based off of the parameters that it's been given. So it naturally accumulates this kind of artifacting, it naturally accumulates this kind of estimated data in the system. So if you're using it as autopilot technology in your car, and if you've been, if you've been informed that that's what it is, that it's autopilot technology, it is really, really, really good for, say, you're tired, you've had a night shift, you've had a rough day at work, you're not driving as smoothly or as precisely as you should be. It's really, really good in improving, driver safety, in that it will correct for that, erratic driving. What it will not do is drive the car for you, because it is not a conscious process. It is the opposite of a conscious process, in that it is blindly predicting off of the existing parameters that it has. So this is why when it's used in sort of like chatbot technology, it starts going kind of off the deep end with you, where it starts talking about socks, or you're talking about the weather and it starts going off about sort of like, socks or fish, and then it just goes off on a string of random letters and numbers and sort of characters, and you're like, what is going on? It's because it's not a conscious process. It's because it is what happens with these types of predictive algorithms, and they have become a lot more advanced. And I, like I said, I'm not, from a techie background, but the JPEG is a kind of a really kind of sort of cute visual example that helps you kind of sort of visually understand what's going on here. It is by design estimating data. So the danger when you're kind of sort of, marketing this as sort of, and I can understand why, because it is, it's very, very easy. So where it is particularly irresponsible to market this as artificial intelligence is it's very, very easy to pass it off as, some kind of sort of magic button or magic bullet. It's very plausible in the short term. So essentially what has happened here is we've had an old technology that's been inappropriately marketed to a naive market. It's, been marketed as this kind of sort of like magic button technology, and ethics aside, if I had somebody pitching this to me, if I was head of a company and somebody was pitching this to me and they gave me a tech demo, I'd be absolutely blown away. I'd be like, wow, goodness, this is going to save me so much money, so much sort of like, you ethics aside, if you were an employer, and somebody marketed this technology that would help save you sort of money and sort of, employees, they need to be fed, they need to be paid, they have sick days, they squishy, fallible human beings. And if somebody marketed this to you as sort of a safe, cheap alternative, ethics aside, practically speaking, you'd be like, oh yeah, of course I'll buy into this. However, what I think is going to be difficult to quantify over the coming years is the long-term consequences of relying on these kinds of systems inappropriately. And this is the other reason that I wanted to talk about this, because it's an incredibly powerful tool when you're using it appropriately. It's amazing at pattern recognition. It's amazing at sort of correcting for, like I said, we use it already. We've used it for a long time, like as autopilot technology, for example. It's going to bring incredible advancements in medicine, in sort of helping to kind of work out sort of like diseases. It's good at problem solving, and it's good at pattern recognition. And when you're using it appropriately for those purposes, it's an incredibly powerful tool. However, the consequences of this kind of inappropriate marketing, I think, are going to be difficult to quantify, because in the short term, it's very, very plausible. In the short term, you can have a perfectly sort of coherent conversation with ChatGPT, for example, in the short term. But because of the way that these kinds of predictive algorithms work, you have to have teams of people constantly training it and keeping it on track, because of the way, and it's designed to do this. It's not it's not that it's broken. It's part of its strength. It's what it's designed to do. It is designed to plausibly estimate. So these predictive algorithms are designed to plausibly estimate data based off of the parameters that it already has. And that is its design, and that is its purpose, and that is precisely why it's really dangerous to inappropriately market it as some kind of directed intelligence. It's the complete opposite. It is absolutely even worse than somebody lying to you. So if you're using it to say you're in finance, or you're using it to manage your databases, or you're writing code or something, what it's going to do by design is it's going to estimate data. And it isn't even, it's worse than having somebody consciously lying to you, because it's not doing anything that it shouldn't do. It's designed to estimate data. And I don't think I really need to explain why it's dangerous to rely on a predictive algorithm that is designed to estimate data when we're handling things like medical databases or finance, for example. So it's such it's a really tragic situation that we're in, where this technology has been, like I said, missold to a naive market. as some kind of, magic bullet technology that's going to, replace squishy, fallible employees that need to be fed and looked after and, given time off. And, it's a really tragic situation because it is an incredibly powerful tool when you're using it correctly. So, like, for example, if you sell somebody a sieve, it's amazing. It's amazing. A sieve is amazing at straining noodles. It's an absolute perfect tool for the job if you want to strain some noodles. However, if you're going to try and sell it to somebody as a boat, then I don't need to explain why that is a dangerous situation. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to share this as kind of a cute analogy to kind of help people. I've encountered a lot of confusion. I've encountered a lot of people kind of sort of like, misunderstanding kind of what this technology is and what it does and how it works. And I kind of wanted to share from my perspective as, kind of somebody who works kind of visually. I thought it might help to kind of share this kind of, visual analogy with people of this kind of like, yeah, JPEGs are, they're clever and they are designed to do this on purpose so that you can keep the file size down. However, it deliberately estimates detail. And like I said, I know things have gotten a lot more advanced, and I know we do have kind of teams of people for things like ChatGPT, but this is generally how these kind of predictive algorithms are designed to work. That is how they auto-generate content. They estimate based off the parameters that they already have. So if you are ordering from, we've had kind of hilarious situations where people have, been given like 1 million chicken nuggets that they didn't ask for, or you're trying to chat to a customer service bot and it's just sort of, it goes off the deep end with you. It's not working incorrectly, it's just been missold and is being used for an inappropriate purpose. It's the entire way that these predictive algorithms work is that they estimate based off of existing data. So I have to contend with the joy of AI art. It's a never-ending wonderland of uncanny valley, and I'm torn between sort of like I personally have an appreciation for the absurd. I don't know if any of you have heard of like Dadaism. I think it might bring a lot of you some solace in these trying times, but yeah. So AI is it's a thing. But yeah, it's kind of why you end up in this situation where it is this kind of uncanny sort of valley where it doesn't understand. So like with a bush, for example, so you have an algorithm, a visual algorithm that's been trained on lots and lots of images of bushes. And we're not even going to go into the licensing nightmare that is AI art. Hopefully you're using, a service that's been, trained via a team of dedicated artists. That's a whole other thing that I won't go off on a tangent into. It's just like, well, if you're already using a team of artists, you could just ask those artists anyway. But anyway, yeah, it's why we end up in this kind of uncanny valley with AI art, in that it doesn't understand what a shrub is. It doesn't understand that shrubs shouldn't have teeth and eyes and hair, but because it uses this kind of predictive mathematical algorithm where it just estimates plausible data. It estimates based off of the parameters that it has. It basically, when you're talking to ChatGPT and it goes absolutely off the deep end with you, or you're trying to generate an image of a shrub and it starts having ears and hair, then what it starts doing is it starts estimating off of its own estimations, like with the crusty old JPEGs. It starts estimating off of its own estimations, and you get all of this artifacting and corruption building up in the system naturally, which is why it's extremely, extremely dangerous to use them inappropriately in this kind of manner. It is incredibly useful for pattern recognition and for correcting correcting sort of erratic, if you've got sort of like, if you've got sort of like I said, I'm talking from a visual perspective, if you've got a line, if you've got a vector line, it'll make it nice and smooth for you. It can do that very, very well. It can, problem solve very, very well. It can autocorrect really well. It can problem solve really well. It's really good at pattern recognition. However, if you're using it to auto-generate novel content, then it's going to start predicting off of its own predictions, which is why it starts to hallucinate and naturally drift. And it doesn't matter if you've got a team of people. This is why it's so dangerous to use it as, if you kind of search up like, we end up with like terrible situations where people are sort of like, searching up, is it safe to eat this berry? It doesn't know what that berry is, and it estimates off of its own estimations. So it will just string off into nowhere. It will just string off into the void. Ever so it may, and it's a part of why it is so kind of easy to missell. It's plausible in the short term. It will work perfectly well. It'll write you a perfectly plausible sentence in the short term, but what will start to happen is that kind of artifacting, that estimated data will build up in the system, like with a database or with code, and occasionally it'll just string off into nowhere. It'll just string off into the void, and you can't predict when it does that. It's such a shame because it is such a powerful tool. However, the way it's being hyped up and missold to a naive, it's an old technology that's been hyped up and missold to a naive market for inappropriate purposes. And I just kind of wanted to have a little chat about it. I wanted to kind of sort of like, share a cute example that might help some people kind of conceptualize it. So yeah, feel free in the comments to, if you have more of a dedicated background in AI or, mathematics or sort of code, if you have more of a dedicated background in this, feel free. I'll leave the comments open. This is kind of my first sort of like, I'm not used to being on camera, so do excuse me. Feel free to roast me if you like. Yeah, I don't know what I've done there. Oh well, so be it. Feel free to, if you're from that kind of background, correct me, kind of elaborate, have a little chat in there, go ahead. I just wanted to kind of highlight, I wanted to use this as a cute example to highlight how this is an unfortunate example of a powerful tool that's been hyped up and missold to a naive market. So yeah, thank you so much for kind of listening. Thank you so much for bearing with. I'm a little bit sort of, this is not my natural habitat. So yeah, bear with me there. Thank you for listening. I do have some t-shirts if you would like to support a poor struggling artist in this trying time. I do sell some t-shirts. If you want to buy some, I'd be hugely grateful. If you don't particularly, there's no obligation. Thank you for listening and stay safe out there. And yeah, if you're going to drive your self-driving car, understand that it's an autopilot assisted car, and that it might keep you safe if you don't try to ask it to drive for you. I'm going to bed. Thank you for listening. Take care.